Welcome, everyone. Get ready because today we are taking an exclusive look straight into the boardroom of your mind. In this explainer, we're unpacking one of the most famous psychological frameworks ever proposed. I'm talking about Sigmund Freud's 1923 theory of the Psychic Triad. We're going to meet the invisible internal committee that governs literally every single choice you make on a daily basis. So, I want you to think about a super relatable dilemma. You've got a massive exam tomorrow, but your friends just texted you to come over for a party or to watch a movie. Why is that such a painfully hard decision to make? Well, one part of you desperately wants that immediate enjoyment, right? Well, another part is just nagging you about your responsibilities. Today, we're going to decode exactly why that internal tug-of-war happens. Here's a quick sneak peek at our agenda for this mental boardroom meeting. We'll start with the ultimate internal conflict, then introduce the three main executives in your head: the primitive id, the rational ego, and the moral superego. After that, we'll see how they balance each other out, and finally, look at some modern critiques of the theory. All right, let's jump into Section 1, Internal Conflict, the everyday struggle. The Psychic Triad is a structural model of personality that Freud introduced back in 1923. According to this theory, your personality isn't just one single voice. It's actually made up of three completely distinct, interacting psychological structures. Every single behavior you exhibit and every single decision you make is the direct result of a continuous conflict and balance among these three forces: your biological instincts, your rational thinking, and your moral values. Now here's the thing, you aren't actually born with all three of these voices. At birth, at 0 years old, you only have the id. During infancy, the ego develops. And finally, between the ages of 3 and 5, your superego forms. Let's break down exactly who these committee members are, starting with the oldest. Moving right along to Section 2, the primitive id, instincts and desires. If the id had a company motto, it would simply be, "I want it now." Think of the id like a crying, hungry baby. When a baby is hungry, it cries instantly. It literally doesn't care if its mother is busy cooking or if the food isn't ready or if other people in the house are trying to sleep. The baby only knows, "I am hungry and I want food immediately." That is the id. The id is the most basic part of your personality. It acts as this massive storage reservoir for all your biological needs, things like hunger, thirst, sleep, and aggression. It's entirely unconscious, completely selfish, and incredibly irrational. In fact, it operates through what Freud called primary process thinking. This means instead of actually solving a problem logically, it'll just create imaginary satisfaction. So if you're incredibly thirsty, your id will literally just make you dream about drinking water to get that quick imaginary fix. So the really crucial point here is that the id operates entirely on the pleasure principle. It seeks pleasure and avoids pain without a single thought given to reality, morality, or consequences. For example, if someone insults you and you feel angry, your id's immediate response is to hit them right then and there. It never waits. All right, let's meet our next executive in Section 3, the rational ego, managing reality. So if the id is screaming, "I want it now," the ego steps into the boardroom with a calm, managerial voice and says, "Wait for the right time." The ego is the realistic part of your personality, and it actually develops out of the id during infancy to help you survive in the real world. The ego is highly logical and rational. It's basically the organized decision maker of the group. Freud actually called the ego the executive organ of personality because it's completely in charge of thinking, planning, movement, and emotional control. And unlike the id, which is entirely hidden in your unconscious mind, the ego exists across all three levels of your mind: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. To keep you safe and functional, the ego performs some pretty amazing mental gymnastics. It starts with reality testing, which is basically distinguishing between what is real and what is just your id's imagination. Then it handles decision-making to choose the most practical course of action. And when the internal conflict gets a little too stressful, the ego deploys defense mechanisms, things like repression or denial, to protect your mind from overwhelming anxiety. It is the ultimate mediator. The ego relies on a core operating system called the reality principle. Instead of seeking immediate pleasure, the ego knows that needs must be satisfied practically. When you see a brand new mobile phone and your id says, "Buy it today immediately," the ego steps in and says, "Let's save money first so we can actually afford it." Now, for our final committee member in Section 4, the moral superego, your conscience. The superego slams its hand on the boardroom table and simply demands, "Do the right thing." Developing around the ages of 3 to 5, the superego is the moral part of your personality. It's made up of all the social rules, cultural values, religious beliefs, and family expectations that you've absorbed and internalized as you grew up. The superego is an absolute perfectionist, and it controls you using two main components. First is the conscience, which acts as an internal judge, actively punishing you for bad behavior by making you feel intense guilt, shame, and regret. The second is the ego ideal, which rewards you for good behavior by giving you feelings of pride, satisfaction, and high self-esteem. It strives for complete moral perfection, ignoring practical reality almost as much as the id does. Let's bring them all together in Section 5, Balancing the Psychic Triad. When we compare all three side by side on this table, you can see exactly how their distinct goals inherently create conflict. The id is primitive, wants immediate pleasure, and follows the pleasure principle. The superego is entirely moral, strives for perfection, and follows the morality principle. Smack in the middle is the ego, completely rational, aiming for practical satisfaction through the reality principle. They are fundamentally at odds with one another. Imagine this highly relatable scenario. You're walking down the hall and you find a large sum of money on the floor. Instantly, your id screams, "Keep it, free money." But right on cue, your superego chimes in with severe judgment. "Stealing is wrong, you must return it." So what happens? Your ego steps in to compromise and says, "Okay, let's ask around to see whose money it is first." Or think about the classic struggle of being on a diet. You see a delicious cake. The id yells, "I want to eat that whole cake right now." The superego fiercely counters, "You absolutely should not eat it, you will ruin your diet and it is terribly unhealthy." Once again, the ego steps in to save the day by suggesting a practical middle ground. Let's just eat one small slice after dinner. The ego is constantly working overtime to create balance between your raw desires and your strict morality. Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, Mental Health and Criticisms. According to Freud, your mental health literally depends on maintaining a healthy balance between these three forces. If your ego is weak and the id dominates, you become highly impulsive, aggressive, and selfish. On the flip side, if the superego dominates, you become paralyzed by severe anxiety, guilt, and perfectionism. You really need a strong ego to adapt effectively. Now, it is important to impartially note that modern psychology does have its criticisms of this theory. Because concepts like the unconscious and the id are invisible, they're incredibly difficult to test scientifically. Critics also point out that the theory relies heavily on clinical observations rather than controlled scientific research. It overemphasizes sexual and aggressive instincts, and it often lacks nuance regarding different cultural and social backgrounds. Despite that, this triad has undeniably shaped our understanding of internal conflict and personality. So let's go back to that party versus studying dilemma. Your id wanted the party, your superego demanded studying, and hopefully your ego negotiated a solid 3 hours of studying followed by 1 hour of partying. Next time you're agonizing over a tough choice, take a step back and ask yourself, who is really winning the debate in your mind's boardroom right now? Is it your demanding id, your strict superego, or your rational ego? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and hey, happy negotiating with your internal committee.